welcome to Financial Footsteps, candid conversations with financial leaders, the podcast that takes you deep into the minds of the masters behind the numbers. Join host Chad Dean as he connects with financial leaders as they share their journeys so that we can gain valuable insight from their failures and triumphs. Get ready for candid conversations, behind-the-scenes anecdotes, and practical wisdom that will transform the way you think about your career in finance. Put down the balance sheet and listen in.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chad Dean. I am the host of Financial Footsteps, and I'm also a recruiter. I've been doing that for 27 years. I am the owner and operator of Integrated Management Resources, which is also the sponsor of this firm, and we specialize in placing finance talent in Phoenix and abroad. So I'm happy to have a very special guest today by the name of Joe Udall. And Joe is, I don't want to take too much thunder away from him, but he's currently the Senior Director of Finance for a local company by the name of Keep. So thank you for joining today, Joe.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Chad. I'm really looking forward to our conversation and kind of talking about my journey.
Absolutely. So I just learned that we're both natives.
Yep.
That's pretty cool. When I meet other people that are not native, they're always like, wow, I've never really met another native before. But you and I growing up here, we clearly know a lot of natives.
Yeah, no, definitely grew up with a lot of people that have been here for a while. I think, like I mentioned, my family's been here since, the 1850s, some of the original settlers, and then my wife's family as well. We both, long lineage here in Arizona.
That's fantastic. That's so cool. I'm first generation.
Yeah.
So what generation are you? Do you know? And then your kids would be?
I think I'm fifth generation Arizonan on both sides. Yeah.
Cool. So tell me about family. How many kids do you have?
Yeah, so I've got 3 kids. I've got Charlie, my oldest, is a 7-year-old boy. And my daughter, Emily, is 4. And then my youngest is 2.5, which is Zachary, married to my wife, Lucy Barney. If you know any Barneys here in Arizona. We've been here since 2017. We met at BYU up in Utah. And then my first job I got down here is with Keep, formerly Infusionsoft. And, they've been really good to me. And we've been here ever since.
Fantastic. So no shortage of excitement going on at your house.
Yes, very busy with a lot of little kids running around doing different events. Like 2 of my kids have gymnastics today, and so they're just loving running around and tumbling, and I love watching the joy that they get from kind of experiencing the world.
Any carnage, any broken stuff, or is it pretty mellow at your house?
Yeah, definitely a lot of broken stuff. We get a lot of bruised faces. My 2.5-year-old is the right size to hit my daughter's orbital bones right now. So she has a black eye at least once a month from them colliding. And I tell her preschool, I'm like, I promise it's her younger brother, but it looks bad a lot.
So you get CPS called on you all the time, right?
Probably.
I remember my first experience with my son had what's called breath holding spells, and he passed out and hit his head and had this bruise, and we took him to the hospital because we didn't know what this thing was, and we were getting questioned by CPS, like, did you cause this? I'm like, no, I swear, it just passed out. And so my other son, my one son broke my other son's arm, and I got CPS again questioning us, so I've been through that routine a few times.
Yeah. No, luckily, no broken bones yet, but I know with my youngest, it's coming, right? He throws himself with abandon everywhere. He's like the kid in the pool that, he just runs and jumps in. Doesn't matter how deep it is. And we did the swimming so that he can learn how to float. But he just has no fear of anything.
Well, let me give you some advice. So, my youngest son, I was always like, well, rub some dirt on it. You'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And hey, don't tell my dad, but they were jumping on a trampoline, which my dad was totally against, in the backyard. Older son landed on younger son's arm, and he heard a crack. And he comes in, he's like, Dad, my arm hurts. I'm like, oh, you're fine. Just rub some dirt on it. And then finally, 2 days later, we were at the older son's soccer event, and the younger son was just playing with his offhand. And I look at my wife, and I'm like, I think we need to go get him checked. And to this day, that had to be 10 years ago, he still reminds me about it probably once a week. Oh, yeah. You remember, you never remember. You don't trust me and believe me that I broke my arm. And so, word of advice to you.
Just believe him.
Just believe him, baby.
The irony is I actually broke my younger brother's arm. We were playing football in the backyard, and I tackled him and landed on him, and he broke, a couple bones in his forearm. And he created a pinched nerve later in life. He's definitely had some issues, and I do feel a little bit bad about that one.
Yeah, you didn't do it intentionally. Yeah. So let's go back. BYU. Why'd you choose BYU?
I think the short answer is, I grew up LDS, so it was always kind of aspiration to go there. Had good enough grades. Tuition's very cheap. My grandparents basically would kind of funneled everyone there by saying, we will pay BYU tuition for every semester anywhere you go, right? So I went to ASU, they're only paying BYU tuition. So if you go to BYU, you don't have to pay for anything. So that was, I think, the initial reason I attended BYU. It's a great school, very strong academics, especially the business school. So I didn't actually know what I wanted to do when I went there initially. I then went and served my mission for a couple years in Puerto Rico. They're only paying BYU tuition, and then came back. And when I came back, I originally went into political science. Like I mentioned, my family's been here a long time. They're all lawyers, right? My father's a lawyer. 3 of his brothers and brother-in-laws are lawyers. My grandfather's a lawyer. His father, Jesse Addison Udall, and his brother were both on the Arizona Supreme Court as the Arizona Supreme Court justices. So, long lineages of attorneys here. And the one thing I always said is, I think I don't want to be an attorney. So that's where I started, is not a lawyer, as opposed to being any. And so I just started exploring other things. I did political science. So I have a political science minor. Didn't love the writing. And then eventually I looked at, finance and accounting, applied to both programs and got accepted, ended up picking finance, and kind of the rest is history. I knew I needed a skill set that would translate, right? And I figured with finance or accounting, any business needs those, and learning the language of business will help me in whatever I want to do.
Where did that realization happen for you?
I feel like I was sitting in a political science class where we were writing, 20-page papers once a week. And I thought to myself, I don't want to do this for a living, right? I don't want to just be writing policy papers. I had done like Model UN in high school and in college, where essentially you go and you try to, get legislation passed in this mock environment representing some country. And I realized I don't love this. I've always enjoyed politics, but I'm like the actual sausage making of politics. I'm like, I became a little disillusioned with it, to be frank. And so I was like, I want to go somewhere where I feel like I can make more of a difference. And I felt like in business, that's kind of what helps make the world go round, right? And so that's kind of what I pursued. And I knew I could make some money there as well, right? I always wanted to be, middle class, right? Or upper middle class. That's kind of what I grew up in. And so I knew kind of what the expectations were to get there, right? You have to get a good education and go get a good job. And so that was kind of the driving force.
Gotcha. Was that an easy conversation to have with the parents and the grandparents?
I had teased my dad my entire life that I was not going to be a lawyer. I'd been quite insistent that that's the only thing I was not going to be. And so of all his kids, none of us are attorneys, whereas some of my other cousins, there is at least 1 or 2 attorneys in every one of their families. But our family, there's no attorneys. So we got 2 finance guys, a nurse, and then my youngest sister is graduating as a writer. So definitely kind of an interesting path. And my dad does say, he's like, I wish one of you guys would have come so I could pass my law firm on, right? He runs his own small business law firm in Mesa, but didn't come to pass.
Yeah. I remember after my second year in college, I called my dad and told him I wanted to take a gap year, but I dreaded that call so much. I was like, what's he going to do? What's he going to say? And when I told him, I held the phone away, and he said, great, sounds good. When are you coming home? And so it just, you build these things up. And so that's good, though, that you already had laid all that groundwork with your dad.
Yeah. And my parents were very supportive. They just wanted us to have a plan, right? It's like, they're like, we don't really care what you do as long as you have a plan and it helps you to achieve your goals. My grandparents, my dad's parents, were a little more strict, right? They were paying our BYU tuition, but we had to write them a letter every year that had a budget. And they would basically tell us, some of my cousins were told, hey, that major is not going to do anything, so you should probably pick something different, right? So they were the STEM majors only. And then everything else was kind of well, maybe you should do something different. They were pretty, I wouldn't say strict. They would still fund the tuition, but they definitely would harass you a little bit. So they were very pleased that I was going into finance. And so, from there, it just kind of, it's worked.
What a cool idea.
Yeah.
You got to write a letter with a business case of what you're doing.
Yeah. No, it was literally, I had to say, here's what I'm doing with all the funds. Here's what I'm doing with my life. Here's my budget, for, housing and rent and books. And it was very, very cool idea, very generous of them. They have 40 or 50 grandchildren, right? So they've been paying a ton of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars to help fund education because it's something that's very important to them, right? And so, my wife's family actually did the same thing. She comes from a family of farmers, but they, had trusts that helped fund, their education, right? It's something that's been instilled in both of us and that we're attempting to pass on to our children.
What a fascinating idea.
Yeah.
I may borrow that if and when I become a grandparent. So,
well, you've only got 2 kids, so hopefully there's not too many grandkids.
We'll see. Yeah, I don't know that I could afford 40 or 50, that's for sure. So there's been a lot of conversation about a lack of accountants. And it's just really hard to find staff accounts just because not a lot of people are going into accounting. You chose finance. What was the genesis of that choice versus accounting?
So the way the BYU finance and accounting programs work is you could only apply in the fall, right? And because I had been doing a different major in political science, I essentially finished my coursework in December and then had to wait until the following fall to apply. So I said, you know, what should I do? I should probably just go get a finance or accounting job. So I actually got a bookkeeping job here in the Valley with Vista Senior Living. You know, they own a couple properties around the Valley. But essentially, I did all the bookkeeping at the corporate level for them. And for me, it was a good experience to say, okay, if I love this, then I'll probably pick the accounting program. If I kind of hate it, then I'll probably pick the finance program, right? And as we were doing the books every day or every month, I realized the part I enjoyed about my conversation was when we talk about what's the future strategy we're going to do, right? The actual mechanics of closing the books were fine. You know, I found like some errors in the way they'd done their property taxes in the past, but I was like, this part doesn't excite me. What excited me is that, you know, it was me and the CEO and the COO and the CFO in a room. It was the four of us in this tiny little room where I'm over here doing the books and they're talking about all the strategy, right? And then they would involve me in those conversations. And I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to help, you know, drive the future of the company. While I was there, they, you know, looked and eventually acquired another property. And now they've, you know, 5, 6, 7x from what it was when I was there in 2013. It's been really cool to watch that growth. And I feel like a lot of that's, you know, been driven by the visionary leadership and then the, you know, financial strategy that helped them execute on that. And that's what I wanted to do. So when it came time to pick a program and accept, I picked finance.
Gotcha. Any regrets there?
I don't know if I have any regrets. As I've come more into the process, I do feel like if you come up as a CPA, there definitely are some advantages if you're trying to get all the way to the heights of CFO. You can definitely do it as a finance only, but there are definitely some companies that if you don't have the CFA, they just won't look at you, CPA. So I don't know if it's a regret. I think I've enjoyed my, you know, work life a lot better in what I've been doing, but maybe it will, you know, hinder me at the top end.
Do you have any other internships besides the one with the
Yeah. So
senior
I did
living?
an internship in Dallas with a retail company. They're called At Home. They have a couple stores here in the Valley, but they essentially sell home decor, huge in Texas. And then they've kind of been branching out. So I went and I was on the finance team and I ended up actually doing a lot of support for like the real estate function. You know, it's like I have like a memory of being in the office really late, getting ready for essentially this 2 or 3 all day review of all the potential like sites in the nation that they could expand to, right? So it's like 600 or 700 sites, 3 or 4 pages each, copying them all, getting it all ready. And essentially we just went through and we reviewed all these sites of places they could potentially expand to. And it's been cool to see them go to some of those, right? And it was a really eye-opening on, you know, what it takes to do like real estate, you know, at a corporate level, site evaluation, and then as well as just seeing what the corporate finance side of essentially a retail company looked like. So great experience, you know, kind of wanted to come back, but then I ended up graduating in December, right? Because I essentially, you know, was ahead on some of my credits, but it kind of messed up my graduating on time schedule. So I graduated in December, so 6 months early. And then I networked into the job I got here at Keep. It was essentially my wife's sister's, you know, husband's brother. So we share, this guy, Austin Call, and we share a sister-in-law that he knew they were hiring a job on the other finance team. And so I applied and it was like over Christmas break. So I remember we're at like this cabin in Provo, Utah, and I'm like on a call doing the homework with them. And then I basically started when we got back from break. So
wow.
Yeah.
That happened quick for you.
It was very quick. Yeah. I like started talking to him in early December and by like the 2nd or 3rd week of January, I was starting.
So you didn't look at any other jobs?
I had been applying and looking at other jobs. I considered going the investment banking route, but I think as you and I discussed, it's a lot of hours. And my wife and I had talked, is that like the life we want, right? Because essentially I'm like, I will just probably not be there for a while. And we, you know, I had our first child that November. So Charlie was born my last semester of school. And so I just basically had to decide, like, do I want to try to be there and find a corporate job where I can be more around? Or, you know, we discussed doing IB and we decided it kind of wasn't right for us.
Did At Home offer you a job?
They did not. They ended up not hiring any interns. They were kind of going through some restructuring at the time. So,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So tell me about your thoughts on what you thought the job was going to be. You sit down, you start doing it. But, you know, tell me about that first couple months.
Yeah, no, definitely the first couple, I would say the first year was just, you know, drinking from a fire hose, right? It's learning how do you interact with business partners. And I guess the job that I was hired for was supporting the sales and marketing teams, right? So I did the revenue support as well as some of the expense support, but the heavy emphasis on revenue at that time. You know, it has changed now, but there was a period where I used to say, I'm like we care about our budgets, but we really care about our revenue, right? Like if we have to spend more to get what we need, we'll do that, right? It like the budgets did not really matter. So it was a lot of support on revenue, being there, I sat on the sales floor, right, which is sometimes is atypical. All the finance teams were embedded, so I sat right outside the CRO's office. He was actually in my like onboarding group, so I had like a relationship with him. So I get pulled in with him. I sent out like a daily sales report, right? So pulling all this data from Salesforce and NetSuite and making sure the color coding is right on our sales performance for all the different sales channels. It was very like, starting and it's like, hey, you've got these things like every day I'm sending these reports out and end of month, like 3 or 4 times a day, I'm refreshing that report. So the last 3 or 4 days of the month, that's all I'm doing is refreshing the report to send it out to the executives. And it was like both what I expected and not what I expected. I supported like our value added sales team where we essentially were selling to our customers new services. And it was a whole new world of here's how you communicate with customers. Here's different ways to get a hold of them and sell to them. And, there's just all these things that in business school, and in finance, a lot of it is talking about the theory of finance, right? So like, how do you value stuff? Do ROIs, WACC calculations? I ended up TAing for like the theory of finance class. We talk about the Fed and how that drives everything in the market, right? And so like we don't talk about that at all in the corporate world, right? It's all just about solving, what the business needs, which for us was finding ways to increase revenue, right? And generally efficiently, but mostly to increase revenue first and foremost.
So any regrets at any point when you're doing that job? You're like, what did I get myself into?
No regrets the first year, right? I felt like I was just drinking from the fire hose, really learning. And then for me, there was a huge like turning point, like basically 11 months in. I started in January, beginning of the fall, the beginning of the next January, my boss, my direct manager said he was leaving, right? And he owned revenue at our company, right? He was the revenue guy. And so they passed it to me. So I'm like 11 months out of school. Traditionally with corporate finance, you do expenses for a long time and then do revenue. And so for me, I just got handed the revenue model because I'd been supporting a lot of those teams, right? And so I just had to kind of figure it out. So they'd finished the annual plan, and I'm essentially trying to figure out how to update it and update the forecast and work with the business. And so I think for me, if you look at like one of the big turning points in my career, is like that was one of them, where I was essentially entrusted with, making sure the revenue for 100 million SaaS company was working, right? Like, do we have the right forecast? Are we actualizing it right? I'm working directly with the CFO on here's what the story of what happened. So the CEO is reaching out to me directly with questions, right? So it was a huge leveling up moment for me. Definitely some longer nights and weekends. And we ended up raising like a convertible debt round 3 months in, right? So, whenever you're going through any kind of diligence, there's all sorts of scenarios you're doing. And so for me, it was definitely just learning and, struggling, but ultimately I think was very successful for me, right? It really I think jumped me a couple levels in my skill set and in my knowledge and in like my understanding of strategy that it really, really helped me.
Why do you think you were able to? Well, first of all, I mean, you're working investment banking hours, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
Kind of ironic.
Yeah, a little bit. There was definitely a lot of that first couple months. And there's a couple times talking to my wife, I'm like, I don't know if I love this. I'm like, I enjoy the work, but I'm like, I'm not loving the hours, right? This is not what I signed up for. And at least like at times with corporate jobs, like they're kind of slow. So it's like I was getting paid the same. And it took like 6 months right before like my new work level and responsibilities started to be more in line with my compensation, right? There was like no change because you got to wait for the cycle. And it was just definitely like, there's a lot of friction internally that was definitely going on.
Yeah. So why do you think you were successful and able to level up? Is it you? Is it your personality? Is it your management? How did all that happen?
Yeah. In this specific situation, I would say it was me because my manager left and then the new manager I reported to had no revenue experience. So it was really just like, you just go figure it out, Joe. And I was like, okay, I'm just figuring it out, right? And then that manager ended up leaving 6 months later, right? And then essentially I was on kind of like a revenue island, right? Where I kind of just reported to a manager, but I worked a lot with the VP or the CFO. So it's kind of just on an island a little bit, just doing it. And I think for me, the one like core reason I was able to solve it is I'm naturally like a very curious person. I just want to know the why of things. And when it came to like digging through a model, wanting to know the why is very valuable because essentially you're just tracing formulas all the way back, right? And once you can trace the formula back, then it's understanding, okay, well, what's this formula trying to do? What are we trying to replicate? Because at the end of the day, all an Excel model is trying to do is, replicate or model something that's happening in the real world, right? Which for us, it's like, okay, are we looking at the right sales channels or the products and what's the mix and what's the AMR, the average monthly price they're paying us? And then do we have the right assumptions for like our attach rates, right? For our Kickstarts, which is like our onboarding service, right? And then, you look at the other levels of SaaS. It's do we have the right churn rates or expansion rates? And it's all just like, what are we doing in the real world? And what are we doing? Like, what strategies do we have to influence that? And you're just reflecting that in numbers. So for me, it was a good understanding that like, hey, the models are like really cool, but at the end of the day, they need to also be a reflection of what the business is doing. And I found that at times a simpler model can be more effective because people can understand it, right? Like, You can have a model. We've had models that are extremely accurate, but no one outside of like a couple people can understand what's going on, right? And so sometimes it's like, well, let's just make it a little simpler. So when we talk about the assumptions, people know exactly what they are. Even if it's like 3% less accurate, it's much easier to have a conversation with the business. And for us, we're a very small finance team, a smaller company, that sometimes the speed to execution is more valuable than the, absolute accuracy.
Yeah. So when you joined Keep, first of all, what does Keep do, just for the listeners?
Yeah, so Keep sells essentially a CRM for small businesses at its core. So if anyone's used Salesforce, essentially think of a CRM for small businesses. Some of our competitors in the past have been like ActiveCampaign or HubSpot. When you think of someone like MailChimp's a little smaller. They just do email, right? We do, a lot more automations around campaigns and landing pages and, Keep business lines. So we're a little more than someone like a MailChimp, a little smaller than someone maybe like Salesforce. And then we specifically target small businesses, $100,000 to like 10 million in revenue, have a dedicated marketing person, usually in like some coaching, consulting kind of role, or our best customers, but we have people from across the spectrum.
So when you joined, how many employees?
When I joined, it was like just under 500 employees.
And how many now?
It's like 330. So it's definitely shrunk a little bit.
But your growth has been meteoric, right?
Yep.
For yourself. So you've been there 7 years?
Yeah, it'll be 7 years in January.
7 years. And you go from coming in as a financial analyst to now senior director of finance. So tell me, like, because you just don't see that, right? That's with one company, anyways, that growth. Tell me about the bumps and bruises along the way. Like, what stands out to you, and what would anything you would have done differently?
Yeah. So I think, talking about that growth, like we just talked about the story of taking over revenue, less than a year in. I think that's kind of emblematic of what has happened, right? I have been like the best internal choice, where I am qualified, but also they don't feel the need to look external for any of the promotions, right? Because sometimes, when like a leader will leave, they'll just say, you know what? Let's just find someone external. Like no one on the team is ready. And for me, what's happened is as people have left, they just look at the team and they say, you know what? We think Joe's the right choice for the role, right? And so it was analyst and senior analyst and lead analyst. And when I was a lead analyst, I was essentially doing all the revenue function with one or two people under me. And then there was another inflection point where we invested in a tool called Looker. It's a BI tool. And so I remember kind of having the choice where it's like, hey, we're bringing in this whole analytics team, and I could either choose to like immerse myself and learn, or I could choose to not. And so I actually remember it was over Christmas break. I'm sitting there trying to teach myself SQL and LookML, which is their SQL and Looker, before everyone comes back so that I can be ready to just jump in, right? Because I had no experience with SQL. I didn't know what it was. So I'm downloading all these free tools and did some paid trainings. And so for me, I had an opportunity to jump in and essentially add an analytics skill set. I wouldn't say I'm like a data engineer, but I can do what most, I think, senior data analysts can do, just because I chose to jump in and co-build our entire instance. So we in finance today, we use a lot of data tables, right? That's built on what our analytics team has done. And like I've built all those tables, right? And like I kind of know what's going on. And so for me, that was like a second inflection point where I added this whole skill set that made me extremely valuable and efficient. And then, a little bit after that, we combined kind of our finance teams. We had like my finance team, which was revenue and analytics. And then we had the other one that was like purely expense. And when one of the managers left there, I was the natural choice to bridge the whole teams together, right? And so just as people left, it was always like, we just have Joe do that. And then in this latest iteration, last November, our CFO left. They had two choices, which is we could try to hire someone right away, we could get a temporary person, and they just decided to, kind of promote me to director. And I essentially bridged the function until our new CFO started this July. So it was about 8 months without a CFO. And so as part of that, like I'm like presenting to the board. I presented our annual plan. I presented our financial results. I attended our investor meetings and presented there, right? I got to be, kind of a strong voice of reason for the finance side of the house, and provide recommendations to the executive team. And, I ended up leading kind of a director team that was driving on some tactical solutions. So it was a great opportunity for me to, really spread my wings and become more of that strategic leader, where in the past, I've done all the tactical, modeling and work. So it's been a really cool opportunity for me at Keep. And, I like to say that some of it's luck, but my grandfather used to always say, you make your own luck, right? Like luck is just, being prepared so that when something comes, you're ready to take advantage of it.
So that's my next question. Put yourself in the shoes of the people that were choosing you, saying, we have this easy internal pick here, and it's Joe. Why you versus somebody sitting next to you?
I think the biggest reason is that I don't want to say I'm outstanding. That's very
No,
arrogant, but
you can throw the humble
well,
pie away. I
yeah.
mean, right now, just it's literally like we're trying to help people out of how do you differentiate yourself?
I think the biggest thing is that I learned the business better than any of the other financial analysts. Like at its core, I understood, like if I was just supporting revenue, it's like I knew all the ins and outs of revenue, right? Like our acquisition, our expansion, our churn. When we needed to figure out payments, I'm the one that like jumped in and worked with our payments people to figure that whole world out, right? And so like whenever there was an opportunity, I just would always naturally jump in, whether asked or unasked, right? And I think that's the biggest differentiator, taking the initiative and going and learning it. And then, as part of that, you're building relationships with the different people in those seats. So like if the, VP is talking to their peers, it's like, well, who do you like the most? It's like, well, they have a relationship with me because I've been making the effort, right? Making the effort and trying to, show myself to be successful. And like I talked earlier, a lot of that's driven by like my deep desire to understand the why, right? Naturally, it comes easy to me. But I feel like that's what made me the natural choice. Is like of all the people, I just had the most institutional knowledge because I've gone and accumulated it. And I understood what the business was doing or trying to do. I've been a business partner with a lot of people and I just kept, just inserting myself. So whenever there was like a special project that's like, we need someone from finance, I would just always raise my hand, right? I'm always like, I'll do it, even though it's more work. Because for me, it's like, I want to learn new things and it makes you more valuable.
What does that go back to? Where does that internal drive? Is it from childhood? Is it your grandpa? Like where do you think that originated?
I think that's a great question. This is like the nature nurture when it comes to raising kids. I think it's probably a combination of both. I definitely come from like a high performing background, right? Like my dad's an attorney. He has like, he got his law degree. My mother, she's currently a principal here in the Valley, but she has a master's degree. So like very successful people. My parents would intentionally try to like include us in conversations. Like my mom and dad have said, whenever they see people doing good things or bad things that we knew, like whether it's in our church group or in our family, they'd like talk through the situation with us, right? Like, here's what they did well, here's what they didn't, so that we could learn from others that were coming. When I look at like my mother's family, like all of her siblings are, extremely successful, right? Like extremely wealthy. And a lot of that came from their father, right? Who was extremely wealthy and successful. So, and then same on my dad's side, my grandfather, very, very successful attorney, read Udall, Lyon, which is a, very large law firm in Mesa. And, that has just been kind of bred into us, right? That you just see successful people, you see what that takes. And so then you just try to emulate and model that.
That's fascinating. And how are you going to model that for your kids?
I think a lot of it is making sure they understand the value of an education, but also like not just the act of going to school, but the act of actually learning, right? Being a lifelong learner. I know it's a very cliche phrase, but I think gives you a leg up, right? If you're constantly just improving yourself every day, you will naturally just be further ahead than someone that is not, right? Like at our company right now, we're talking about this goal of improving 1% every day, right? And the concept is if you improve 1% every day and you look back in a year, you will be more than 365% better, right? You'll be significantly better. And like, I think instilling that in myself and then helping my children understand that, and like you have ups and downs, but the goal is to strive to be better every day, even if you don't necessarily see the progress right away.
That's commendable, right? Because it doesn't necessarily exist. And I think one of the hardest things in the world is raising good kids. It's a challenge, right? So I wish you luck on that journey, and I hope you're as successful as your parents were and your grandparents were.
Thank you. It's definitely a different world now, right? Looking at my siblings, so I graduated high school in 2009. So like one of my friends had an iPhone. Then my sister, who's 7 years younger, everyone had smartphones, right? Like I didn't get my first smart home until after my mission when I came home. And I just feel like the microscope and bubble that they live in, right? Where you can see all the short form content, you can see what everyone's doing at any moment. Like for me, that didn't exist. Like I got a Facebook in like 2007, but it was just kind of like, oh, we posted some pictures, but like we weren't on it very much, right? And it's just like the world is so different today than it was for us. And so just finding a way to make sure like our kids stay connected to nature and like, go out and do, we have iPads, but it's like we try to limit that time, right? Just because I think there's a lot of value in just, the power of imagination. Kids will find stuff to play with, right? You just have to force them to do it, right? And I feel like that's part of, helping them, grow. But, we've talked about it, like it's definitely hard, right? Like we, and I think every generation says that, right? It's a whole new world and the world's always changing and you just have to figure out what works best.
Yeah, I wonder what my parents said when, oh my gosh, he's growing up on color TV. What's that going to do to him?
Yeah. Color TV. Now we have HD and 4K, we can actually see what's going on.
I was I was having lunch with some guys yesterday. I said, my favorite gift that I ever got was an Atari. And I'm sure my parents were like, oh my gosh, he's going to be sitting there. He's playing asteroids for like 2 hours at a time. And if you think back, that was a big revolution,
Yeah.
the home video game. And I played a lot of Missile Command and asteroids, but I think I turned out all right because we still had the bikes. That was
Yeah.
much more fun. You got bored of playing the games, and when I look at my children, they're different. Like one does like his computer, but he plays strategy games. And the other one doesn't even have a computer. If he does, he doesn't do much on it. He's always doing other things outdoors. So I think a lot of that's personality driven
Yeah.
as well. So, but it is a scary thing because when they're younger and the distraction here's an iPad, watch a show.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed for me, so I grew up, playing some video games. My dad was really big into strategy games. We played like StarCraft and Warcraft. And, like as an aside, I remember the first time I beat my dad, I was like 7 years old in StarCraft. I essentially did like a little drone rush on him. And it was like, and I remember hearing him yell and get frustrated and quitting. And it was like one of like a very proud moment to me. And that, to me, that's something I've actually done with my kids where like, I do not let my child beat me. Like we play chess, my 7-year-old and I, and like I beat him every time. But I know that the day he actually beats me, it'll be a big accomplishment, right? I don't want to let you win, right? I want you to earn it. And it's a huge, it's a huge win. It's the same reason I hate playing Candyland because I lose every time because it's all luck. But for me, I'm like, I feel like that's part of, instilling that in your kids. It's just that competitive drive and wanting to win. And like that can manifest in different ways. But the desire to win, I think, is very valuable in being successful, right? Because you have to want it.
I think kids are going to be able to tell if you gave up too,
Yes.
totally. and let them win. And then it doesn't mean anything.
Correct.
I remember when my son first beat me in golf, and I was trying. I was not letting that kid beat me. And it's the same thing. I listen to Tiger Woods talking about Charlie Woods. He's like, I'm not going to let him beat me just to do it. So that's huge.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in getting that like sense of accomplishment, right? Because you think of our lives, right? Like a lot of what we do is finding ways to find gratification or happiness, right? And like there is something to earning something as opposed to me giving something, right? So like just like earning the opportunity to like beat your dad at something, right? Like it's kind of like a big opportunity or task in life, right? Because for a lot of kids, like your dad or your mom, your parents, your grandparents, they can be your heroes. And so to finally like surpass them in something is a big deal. And it's like a good, I think, opportunity, like object lesson to provide them, right? By not letting them win.
Absolutely. So that's a great life lesson and a good thing for parents to think about as well, because too many times parents, I think they're busy and they just give their kids something to keep them busy, and they're not involved in their lives. And it sounds like you're very involved in your lives, and that's
Try to be. And I will say sometimes we'll just put the TV on, right? But we try to, especially now that the weather's getting better, right? Like I know I came down today and my son had snuck downstairs. My two boys were watching some TV and it's like, no, guys, the weather's good. We'll go outside. We have an in-ground tramp. And I'm like, you can run around and play in our backyard. Like, let's just be out there. It's, a lot better than just, sitting and vegging. So we definitely try to encourage that in them and be responsible. But, we're definitely by no means perfect. It's not like we have a no electronics rule either, but it's, usually it's like we're doing it if we're doing it as a family, right? It's not solo, which is what can happen with the iPads.
Well, mine turned out all right.
Yeah.
So
I think they'll be fine. My brother, like talking about the video games. So my brother actually ended up being like a pseudo professional video game player, so he played this MOBA, it was called, but he won ASU tuition for a year or for the rest of college from Blizzard, the company that makes it.
Oh my gosh.
So he got to meet Michael Crow and got, paraded around. So that was a really cool experience. Then went professional in that game, then streamed on Twitch. And it was like, it's the kind of thing where it's like, we always joke that video games are like, whatever. It became a pseudo career for him, right, for a couple years. And now he's, transitioning to being a nurse. But it was a really cool opportunity. Like a documentary was made about him or about his journey. That, it's like a really cool thing, right? That like video games are not just the time sink, maybe some people think, but I also think it's all in moderation. Like for me, when I've enjoyed video games, it's when I'm playing with people I know. It's about the community you're building as opposed to just playing alone, So I think that's where you got to find the balance, right? It's like, does this provide you a community that's like making you a better person? If the answer is yes, I'm like, go for it. So
yeah, fascinating. And your brother's name?
Michael Udall or Mike Udall.
If anybody wants to look it up and read about his story, that's
I wish I knew what the documentary is called, but yeah, it was on.
I'm sure
it's on YouTube. It's on YouTube somewhere. Mark Cuban's in it, so it's kind of a cool little thing. He was on ESPN3, like his tournament at the end that he won. It was called Heroes of the Dorm. So it's a really, really cool experience. We went and supported him when he was there in Seattle. And he'd gotten second the year before. He'd lost the year before. And so it was really cool to like watch the arc of him come back and kind of win it like in a very dominant fashion the following year. So
That's fascinating.
yeah.
That's so fascinating. That's so cool. So tell me, are you a natural leader? And and I think you might be, but when you had that first leadership experience, tell me about that and what did you learn and what did you learn about yourself?
Yeah, so I actually been reflecting on this. We did like a whole experience on tell us your journey as a leader at work recently, right? To help us, think about this. And so for me, it really goes back to kind of like the beginning for me. Like literally like I'm the oldest child. I'm like the second oldest cousin and the fourth oldest cousin on each side with lots of cousins, right? So I feel like from a young age, I was kind of thrust into leadership, even though from like disposition, I'm a little more introverted, right? Like I wouldn't say I'm like a natural, like rah leader. I've always been from the time I was young as like a do as I do, right? Like follow my example kind of leader. And I know I've learned in business that like that works up to a point, but at some point you need to learn to delegate, right? You need to learn to inspire, right? So like that worked as a child, and then I did Boy Scouts. I was an Eagle Scout, and on my mission, I had, all the leadership roles, right? Like the very last one, assistant, I was leading a team of 180 missionaries across the mission in different areas. So it's like I've had a lot of this natural leadership given or thrust upon me throughout my life, right? So I feel like I've been, which in some ways is nice because like the first time I was like a lead or a manager in business, it wasn't my first time, right? Like I've been doing this my whole life. I do think the thing that is very different in business, right, is one, you're dealing primarily with adults, right? So it can't just be as like the older brother, I can physically overpower you, right? Like if I have to lead by force, you can. Like you can't really do that in business, right? You have to understand what motivates people and how you get them to buy in to what you're doing. And then, it's interesting that like I like to be as honest and transparent as possible, right? And in finance, sometimes like that is at odds with what I'm asked to do, right? Like anytime you're going through a transaction, often it was like the CFO would tell me, you cannot tell your team about this, right? And so it's like I don't want to lie to them. And so you have to like, how do I get their help with some things without telling them what they are, right? And so I think there's a lot of, navigating you have to do where, like for me personally, I like to be very honest and transparent, but like that's not always possible. So for me, leadership, I think has been natural, but also unnatural. And I think like I am striving to improve on my, how can I inspire people and coach them up? Because that's not something I've had to do as much, right, in my life. And so I think for me, that's been like where I've really been focused the last couple of years.
How did you come to that realization? Because there's the Eagle Scout. I'm the Eagle Scout. You're the Cub or whatever.
Yeah.
And do what I say. There's the military leadership style. Same thing. Do what I say. You're going to get court-martialed. Then there's the trying to understand what makes people motivated, and then focus on that. And here's how I'd help you achieve that by
Yeah.
this. Tell me about that transition of learning that. Did you read a book? Did somebody help you out on that? Because I had to learn that myself. I'm very much hey, I'm out front. I'm running. I want everybody running just fast right behind me. And I did that. And then I looked back and I went, nobody's behind me.
Yeah, I think it was a combination of I realized at some point that like what I had been doing was not working, right? Like I had some analysts that like that first style worked, right? They're just like just follow, do the same thing, right? That's the style they wanted. And then I have other analysts where they're just like that does not work for them. They want to understand why. They want to like be more involved. They want to have stuff better explained to them than just like do this because that's what we need to do, right? Like or this is the right way to do things. And so it really just came down from like some friction with some relationships and just learning, okay, how do I resolve this? And someone was talking to people internally. Someone was talking to my parents, like my mom, like I said, she's a principal, right? So she deals with tons of people all the time. And I think just getting that advice from them was very helpful and just learning like, hey, this do as I do style works for some people. It doesn't work for everyone, right? And so just having to modify and adapt has kind of been kind of the journey I've been on.
Gotcha. I learned about a concept called servant leadership, and that's what I follow. So it's that serving the people themselves. So I'm there to serve. As a leader, I'm here to serve you, but I have to know what makes you tick, what your motivations are. So that was a transformation that I had to go through, and I think I'm still growing as a leader. It's one of the most challenging things for me because I'm slightly introverted as well. I could just sit there on the weekend and work on my vehicle all weekend and just be fine. Whereas my wife's a little, she needs to socialize and stuff like that. So it's interesting that you recognize that though. That's
like,
cool.
Yeah, it sounds like we're in the same marriage. My wife, very extroverted, and I'm like 45% extrovert, 65 per whatever, 55% introvert. I'm definitely hedged there a little bit. And yeah, no, it's definitely been a journey and an experience. And I feel like it's something that for me as a more introverted person, it's something I'm going to always have to focus on, right? Like do as I do, it just comes naturally, and then the other one does not, right? And so you got to work on the things that you're not good at.
Hmm. Without getting anybody in trouble, do you see yourself and people that you've managed in the past, and has it stood out to you and it reminded you of yourself?
Yeah, no, there was definitely one analyst, Jared, who I think I've told him this, who he left like a year ago, but he very much reminded myself. He was like essentially I hired him. I was 3 years in. He'd been at IBM, but just the way that he worked and approached the job was very similar to me, right? And it's been really cool to watch his progression and development. And he interestingly has kind of wanted to pursue more the data analyst path, right? Where we both started and did the finance and data, and for him, he really wanted to do the data stuff. So I just kept giving him more and more and more, and now that's kind of where his career has taken him. So it's been awesome to watch him kind of grow and blossom in starting in finance, but finding a different passion.
Is it tough to let somebody go like that?
I was really sad when he left. And then there was an analyst right before him, Jake, who like the three of us had been together for 2 or 3 years. We were together when COVID hit, right? So it's like you go through that. I don't want to call it traumatic, but it's just like a big life shakeup, right? And so it was definitely the two of them left within like 3 or 4 months of each other. And so it was definitely like a hard transition, right, for me. But like obviously always excited for someone's next steps, right? Like my philosophy has always been you should do what's best for you. And like for me, in some ways, I see it as like a success that you've like outgrown what you could do here, right? Like to me, that means you've been successful and I've helped coach and mentor you. So like I see that as a win, even though personally for me it makes it hard, right? It makes my day to day harder, but like that shouldn't stop you from doing what's best for you.
No, you have to let them go.
Yeah.
You have to let them grow.
I'd like to say it's good preparation for when my children grow and leave the house, right? I get experience this in a micro way, so I'll be a little more prepared for when they, really start pushing back in their teenage years and then, want to leave and do their own thing.
Hmm. So I have hired a lot of people, and not all of them still work for
Yeah.
me. I find one of the hardest things is interviewing people and trying to figure out what makes people tick. So what do you look for, especially in a junior candidate, right? So we're this audience, a lot of these are going to be students, and they're thinking about how to prepare for their first interview and stuff like that. What do you look for when you are interviewing junior staff?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. It's actually one I think I've struggled the most with because I feel like when I was in school, there was all these like, oh, you do these case studies and you have all like your star stories ready. But like at its core, right, like all they're trying to really filter for is like, are you smart enough to do the job and do you have like the right approach and temperament at its core, right? That's what I'm looking for because most people coming out of school, we will teach you a lot of the technical skills. Like, unless you're like completely incompetent in Excel, most of them have some experience, different levels of experience, but you can train them up on what you need, right? And they're going to have to learn whatever models we're doing, anyways. And unless they like have worked in SaaS or intern in SaaS, we're going to have to teach them a SaaS business, anyways, right? So for them, I'm really trying to figure out can you think the right way? And so I actually do something maybe that's a little bit atypical in the interviews is I like to kind of give them an overview of the role. I'll ask them a little bit about their experience. And then like my go-to is actually to just give them time and see what kind of questions they ask. And then I will kind of respond to that. And the reason I do that is, at least at Keep, a lot of what our job is ambiguous, right? It is not, we have like our set things we do, but the support you're going to do for the business is going to be different every month, right? And like what their needs are going to be different. And so I need someone that's willing to kind of ask the types of questions to extract from the business what we need, right? They're going to say like, I want to find a way to grow sales. They're not going to, and you have to interpret, okay, what are the metrics you need to go find? And like, what are the actuals and who are the people that are going to drive those, right? And you have to like connect a lot of the dots on your own, which can be very hard coming out of school. When some roles, you're just going to show up and they're like, here's like your box, right? Like we are a much smaller company. Like you're going to support directly our CRO or our CMO or our CPO, right? Like you're supporting exec right away, which is why we generally don't hire brand new. I was actually very atypical in that they hired me straight out of school. So for me, it's much more, can you think, are you naturally curious and going to ask the right types of questions? And by giving them that platform, I get to see how they approach it. Because there's some that I can tell after, 5 minutes, I'm like, this isn't going to work, right? You don't have the right approach and mentality. You probably haven't done any prep work, right? Because usually, at least, like you don't have to understand SaaS, but like it's not that hard to Google how does a SaaS company work and to understand like, the basic pillars of a SaaS company.
I'm shocked when when younger kids would come. I don't want to throw any particular programs under the bus, but they would show up and they wouldn't half time have anything to write on,
Yeah.
which blew my mind. Have you seen that before?
There's been a couple, it's been interesting that like now in like the post-COVID environment, so many of my interviews are over Zoom, right? So it's like you should have something to write on, and I would hope you have some questions prepared, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
And that's what I coach when I coach anybody, and I have a pretty extensive interview coaching process that I go through. But the standard is do your research.
Yeah.
Do the research on the person that you are interviewing with. Do the research on the company. Do the research on any news that's come out, and then formulate interesting questions based on what you've read and show that you have interest in the company, because too many people have come in and interviewed with me and they're like, okay, so what are you going to do for me? What's this company going to do for me? You're dead in the water at that point.
especially in an entry level role, right? Like, you need to show that you're willing to look and do the work. And like, at least for my industry, SaaS, right? Like there are very standard SaaS questions you could ask, right? Like what's your retention rate? What's your, is your ARR growing? What's your, growth rate, right? Like you can ask very basic things, and it shows me at least understand what metrics we cared about. What's your LTV to CAC? How do you measure it, right? Like there's very simple questions you can ask. And I'm like, okay, you may not understand SaaS, but like a Google search gets you there, right? Like you go to Google, what are the top metrics in SaaS, and just look them up. And they may have like slightly different names in different places, but at its core, you're really just trying to understand what's the retention, and are you spending all the money now, and is it going to get you where you need to go? Because with SaaS, it's like a trough, right? You spend the money now, you're in the hole for some number of months, and then you start making money on that cohort in the future, right? It's not like a widget where, I spend $5 on a widget and sell it for 10. This is like I spend $1 million to get $10,000, which is a really bad ratio. And then over time, it pays back.
Mhm.
You spend $1 million to get 100,000, and then in 10 months it breaks even, and then from there, you're making money, right? And so you just stack cohorts and cohorts and cohorts and get the retention as good as possible, and then before you know it, you have a company that's making money hands over fist. That's why with SaaS companies, you can see like the crazy 50%, 100%, quarter over quarter, year over year growth rates, is because they've done all the work to stack it, and then now it starts all paying off right at the same time.
Yeah. So going back to your interview, I know you had an inside edge on that, but did you do Google research, and what did you do to prepare?
Yeah, you're taking me to the Wayback Machine. I know I definitely Googled SaaS companies to try to understand. And I do know that Austin had given me a couple questions to ask. And then the other thing that I like to do now is I try to understand, like what's the current state of like the team. And, often I think that's helpful for you as someone coming in, because if you understand what like the dynamic looks like, it's much easier to understand how are you supposed to fit in that picture, right? Like, am I coming in as a junior analyst? Okay, then you can start asking like, what kinds of work do I do? Who I interact with? Like, it's very simple to just start getting in, and some of that you can look up, some of it you can't. So I know I asked some of those kind of questions. I definitely asked like, what happened to the prior analyst, right? I think that's a very common question. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. It's been a long time. I'm doing more interviews now, but not right now. I care a lot more about culture and fit, right? Like,
Yeah.
what kind of company, why did the prior director leave? Because that can often tell you a lot about the state of the company. I know I've talked to some where I'm like, you know what, that doesn't sound like the right culture for me. Like, I'm obviously in a polo right now. I usually wear like a hat and t-shirt most days to work. Like, I work in tech. It's very casual, very much you show up and you do your job. That's what matters, right? Not, am I dressed, in the appropriate business casual or whatever, right? Like those things do not matter as much.
And I like to kind of finish on this, but going back, what's something that you wish you knew when you were in school, or at least in your first, call it 6 months after graduation in your new job? What's something that you wish you knew?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. I think, one thing I think maybe I wish I had done more preparation on was understanding, exactly what the different finance or accounting paths where they can take you. I feel like in some ways I've been very fortunate, and that like I have been able to rise very quickly. But, there is a good chance where I see people's resumes where it's like you'll go into a corporate finance job and you could just get stuck there for a while. Like Jared that I was talking about, he was at IBM for 2 years, and he basically said it's like they didn't always have work for people. Like it was very difficult to grow. The managers changed a lot. And so I feel like sometimes it's like, hey, you get a big name on your resume, it's going to be helpful. But sometimes those jobs are not as conducive to growth as like a smaller company can be. So I would say like, as you're trying to explore what it is, try to talk to people, like network with people that are in jobs. Cause like, I know for me, like if I have a student reach out, I will usually jump on a call with them and talk to them, right? Like, I think there's a lot to be learned just from people that are in the industry. what they're doing, the paths they've taken. Because, there are like the core, paths where it's like you do Big Four accounting or you do investment banking or you go work for some big corporation in their rotational program. Those are very standard. And like those lead to certain paths. And I've taken definitely a much more less traditional path, right? I started a tech company, which is really good, but it's not a big one, right? So because of that, I've been able to touch and experience essentially everything you can do in finance at this company, right? I've touched all of it, helped lead and drive strategy for a lot of it. And so that's been very unique. Whereas some people, it's like you just supported this one business unit the whole time. And so I would say, like, know what you want. And as part of what I've done, it means it's a little less ambiguous. You have to be a little more of a self starter. It can mean like my close is not always consistent, right? Or my hours are not consistent because there's just more stuff that can happen and go on. So just know that, where you go is going to have a big driver on your future. And sometimes I wish maybe I should have done a little more preparation and research on like what it meant to work for a tech company, because I was just like, oh, just looking at different jobs and this is kind of was the best option I had.
So for the listeners that didn't pick up on it, you are out interviewing and you're transitioning.
Yep.
Are you finding, based on your background, I'm going to expose you a little bit here, but are you finding based on your background, resistance? You did mention the CPA, but are you finding any resistance and questions of, hey, why'd you choose this route versus going another route? Does that come up?
I don't get the questions as much there. I do know there have been some like director, VP, or head of finance roles that I look at that basically it's like if I don't have the CPA or I didn't do investment banking, there are some that it's like that's just like the deal breaker, right? Right away. Now there are plenty of others that I can go through. And then the other big, I guess, like barrier for me is like I have just under 7 years experience. A lot of times for those roles, it's 8 to 10 or 12 plus. So like that is what that's more like the ceiling I run into at times, right? For some companies, it's fine. For others, like it definitely is a barrier where it's like, and to me, in some ways, it's kind of a blessing where like if a company says you have to have 12 years experience, that tells me a lot about like maybe the culture and how rigid they are, which may not be like the best fit for me, right? Like I don't necessarily need a place that's extremely rigid on like those kind of hiring requirements because it could tell me that maybe they aren't as open to kind of like the changes maybe that need to be made, right? Like it can tell you a lot about the internal culture with the way sometimes they'll just filter candidates.
Mm-hmm. Well, a natural fact that our listeners should know is when you get into these big corporations, it's very lockstep.
Yep.
There's a lot of requirements, and it's not necessarily the hiring manager that has those requirements. It's probably going to be human resources. They've
sure.
got to have this many years. You've got to have this degree. You've got to have a CPA, or it's just not going to work. And so if you go to those larger corporations, you can run into that, right? And so what also happens though is you have those big companies that say, I want somebody with big company experience because they understand that. And then you get somebody from a smaller company who says, I don't want somebody from a big company because they're not as versatile as somebody like yourself that's done a lot of different things. Instead of, like you said, here's your box, then here's your next box, here's your next box. You've been exposed to so many different things, which has allowed you to rise quickly in your titles. So it's kind of interesting. You can choose one path or the other. And most of the guests that I've had on here they've had public company experience and they've had smaller company experience. And it seems like they all seem to really gravitate towards that smaller company experience because you're the big fish, smaller pond, can see your impact greater, your direct impact on the company. Here it is. This is what I did. I accomplished this.
For sure. And I think there is something very gratifying, right? To know it's like I just did all this work and then you see the company shift and change and to just see like the positive or the negative, right? But just to know like you were directly involved, right? And like what you do every day really matters. Where I know I've talked to people that worked at, Intel or larger companies where they're like, sometimes they're like, I feel like if I didn't show up, it wouldn't have mattered, right? Which frankly is probably true at some of the really big companies, right? Like if you don't show up for a little bit, it's fine, right? Like they'll probably fire you, but it's not like the company's going to go down where, like for our analysts, conversely, sometimes it's like, hey, if you're like gone for like, if you just leave, like that can put like a real crimp on what we can do, right? Just because you're smaller and leaner, right? So it matters, but I think it also includes its own level of stress and pressure, right? So I think just for new people, you just have to understand like, what is it that you want out of life, right? Like, what do you want out of a job? If you just want a place you can show up and get a paycheck and then kind of check out, sometimes like the big companies actually are like at times, I think very good for that. You can show up, you can start your side hustle on the side. I have done some of that here. I had like a data analytics consultancy from some of my coworkers here, right? So I've been able to do pieces of that here, but definitely there's a lot of pressure and stress sometimes where it's like, I know like if I am not there, like there's just stuff that other people struggle to do or won't be able to do as well, especially if the team's in any kind of transition.
And not that there's anything right or wrong about wanting to be ambitious and go and get the
Yep.
CFO title versus somebody that wants to come in, be a team player, execute their job, at 5 o'clock leave and go home and do their own thing, right?
What matters is what you want out of life. What do you want it to be? Because like to be a CFO, right? There's going to be, yeah, you'll make more money, but there's a lot more stress, a lot more hours, and you just have to just like ultimately. I think if I was there, I think if you ask people like, oh yeah, I want to be a CFO, and it's like, well, do you really know what that means, right? So at some point, you just have to understand like, what is it that you want out of life, right? Because you can make a ton of money, you can have like an amazing work-life balance. There are some places you can do both of those, but they're harder to find, right? Like in a lot of ways, you got to pick a path, right? And I know listening to some of your other podcasts, a lot of them talked about it's like a lot of hours and a lot of work, and they've gotten to where they're at, right? And maybe you can enjoy more of it later. I've been lucky in that I feel like my work-life balance has actually been pretty good, 80% of the time all along the way, right? There's been obviously periods of stress when you're doing some kind of transaction or starting something really new, but for the most part, I'm like, I can work, a 40 to 50 hour week most weeks, right? And now in the post-COVID world, we're hybrid. I'm home 3 days a week. So I've gotten to, with my oldest child, he was like 4 when COVID hit. And so I missed, I was kind of around, but I missed a lot of that with my younger two. My daughter was 6 months old when COVID hit. So I've got to see like everything. I always got to see her walk and start talking. And my youngest son, I've just been able to be around and, you can do like lunch with them, or pick them up from school or something, stuff that, in the old world I couldn't do. And so understanding what it is that you want out of life will help you, I think, make better decisions in where you go. And in some ways, like I would argue if you're single and like you really want to like drive forward on a career, like you really should do Big Four or IB, right? Like the best time to do that is when you just have you and you can really, I think, accelerate your career in a lot of ways, right? Like it gives you a leg up, I think, moving forward, but you just have to know what's going to work for you and what you want out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's so cool that that you're getting to see your kids. Do you feel that that pendulum is going to swing back on the hybrid? Just, I'm asking you that because I've seen it a little bit, and we, as a recruiting company, we don't necessarily work on remote jobs because they're very easy to fill. So we're working on the ones where they want them in 5 days a week,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Do you sense that? I mean, you're out talking to other companies. Do you sense that pendulum coming back?
I do think it's coming back. And I think, it's very interesting where there are a lot of people that have these long leases. Like I know for us, like we are in our building to like 26 or something, right? Like we're in a long lease. So for us, it's like we're either using it or we're just like wasting it, right? So I think for a lot of companies, there is a pressure to bring people back, and some of it may be financial. I do like personally, I believe there is something to being in person, right? Like I think there is like a connection that is hard to make through Zoom. And I would argue that especially if you are new, an in-person job is going to help accelerate you faster than a remote job, just because there are all the water cooler moments, right? Where you just run into people and you can build those relationships and, okay, we just had this meeting and as we're walking to our next meeting or whatever, I can connect with someone. Like that does not happen on Zoom as naturally, right? Like or on web conferencing. It's just not as natural to happen. So I do think newer in your career, in person will help you more. Remote does give you more flexibility. I know like for my next role, I'm looking at both in person, hybrid, remote. And if it is a remote one, I'm always like, hey, I'm definitely willing to come in, especially a lot the first 6 months, because I know how valuable it is to come build those relationships with people. I just think it's easier to build the relationships and humanize them in person, right? So I think some form of hybrid is probably going to exist. I think it'll never be the same as it was, but I do think the pendulum is swinging back to more companies bringing people in than before, right? Before you had a lot of remote and a lot of in office and not a ton of hybrid. I think you'll see more hybrid now, but I do think the pendulum's coming back. And I think some of it's frankly is driven by the commercial real estate, right? Like people are paying for it. So you might as well bring people back.
Yeah, I don't know what's driving Google and Meta to bring people back, though. That's good. I can't wait to see the cases on this, the case studies where they look at this 15, 20 years, 30 years from now ago, because that was such a dramatic change in the modality of work.
Yeah.
And we got to live it. And just it's crazy. And so I look forward to seeing what happens in the future. I'm old school. Like most of my career was in office every day. So
and I think it's going to become very like role dependent more than it was, because before it was everyone's in office, and I'm like, I think there are some roles that it's easier to just be remote, right? You just get less interruptions. Like I know I joke right now, like my 2 days in office are by far my least productive, right? Because we're only in office 2 days, that's when all the meetings are scheduled and you're like connecting with all the people, right? And so like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, that's when I like actually do work, and Tuesday, Thursday is when I'm, in meetings and talking to people and, making those connections to, drive the business forward. So I feel like that may be what it looks like moving forward. It's like any more of the solo work or the hard modeling for us, right? That all happens, on the days you're not in office because, you can like shut your Zoom and email and you can just kind of jam, right? Whereas in your office, people always come grab you or talk to you or whatever.
That's a fact. So I grew up in the bullpen era, right,
Yeah.
where everybody's in the bullpen and the managers were in the offices around. Now I have millennials working for me. They're awesome. They're actually changing my mind on this. And we're doing studies on, well, you're getting more done when you're not in an office where there's distractions and music going and all this. And so my mindset is changing at my age. You can't
Yeah.
teach an old dog new tricks, but I'm actually coming around. We're saying, yeah, you know what? And then I start paying attention. I'm like, yeah, this is distracting. I'd never
Yeah.
thought about it before. I just did it and it was what we do. But now I'm starting to think about it.
Yeah.
And as a leader, I have to obviously think about the future of the company and how we're going to do it. So I've learned a lot in that respect.
For sure. Yeah, there's like so many little things you don't quite realize. Like I always joke, like at home, the bathroom or the water, like in my kitchen, is like right next to my office. Where I'm at now, I have to like go down the stairs and walk across the building. Right? It's like for me, going to the bathroom at home is like, oh, like it's literally a 5-second walk. Whereas in the office, it's a minute walk, right? And so like you do that, like, and you think that adds up over the course of the year, like, there's all these little things in the commute, right? Like when I'm at home, I can start at like 8:15 when I finish dropping off my kid. Whereas in the office, I don't get there till like 8:45 or 9, depending on my commute, right? Like there's all these like little times where it's like you just lose that time where I could be working, right? Or I could be driving, right? And then when it comes to like eating food, like my lunches are a lot faster at home because we have leftovers or we've already made something. Whereas if you go out to eat, right, that's an hour and a half, right? Like I just think there's a lot of little things that it's like, okay, there's connections, but I think a hybrid approach for a lot of companies will be the most efficient, even if maybe it's not, it doesn't fully conform to like the way that work has been done in the past. I feel like there are a lot of things you can do much better at home, a lot more quickly and efficiently. And I think you'll have a lot happier employees, which in some ways is, just as valuable, right? Like if you're really happy, it's much easier to like go the extra mile than if you're not.
Well, I'll tell you from a recruiting perspective, if you're not offering hybrid, you're going to have a challenge.
Yeah.
It's just a fact. And you're going to get a bigger pool of candidates if you're looking if you have a hybrid first.
Yeah.
Some people say remote first, hybrid first. I learned another one where it's a flex schedule. If you have something to do with the kids, you got to take them to the orthodontist. I have an orthodontics pen from my kids. Good one, by the way, if you need it. So it's interesting how that's going to be going forward. So you're talking to other companies. And so how do people get in touch with you? And then you also mentioned that you like talking with students, which is absolutely fantastic. And the fact that you put that out there. So how do you suggest that people get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think the easiest way for business people to get in touch to me is on my LinkedIn. I do, my email and my phone number are on there, right? But if you just look me up on LinkedIn, it's a picture of me and my wife and my kids.
Beautiful picture, by the way.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, and like my Zoom background when I log in, it's just a picture of my 3 kids, right? Like family is very important to me, right? And so I find like in a professional setting, if you start with that, it often is a conversation starter. I feel like it helps humanize me, which makes people naturally like you more. I think there's a lot to just like making yourself be a normal person because at the end of the day, when we're in a job or a role, like we're all people, right? We have something that we're doing outside of work. And the more people understand about that, the more they're naturally going to like you, which I think can really help you. And I don't say that as like a way to manipulate people. I just have found like when I get to know someone, it's much easier to like have empathy and want to work with them and catch up with them. And so like, that I think is a final piece of advice is like, as you're working with people, try to get to know them as a person, not just in their like role and title. And it will make your life easier, right? Like it just make your job easier. People will care more about you. You'll care more about them. And like, I think that can really drive, just a lot of success for anyone, right? Because at the end of the day, we're all people, right? Like we're all living our lives and we all want to be happy and be successful, right? We all want the same things, even if they come in different forms.
Yeah. But it is important, and as silly as it sounds, that LinkedIn picture is very important.
Yeah.
People look at that. They remember that. And I remember that about your picture. Beautiful family. And why not be family first and put that out there?
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
So definitely professional, right? Like
yeah,
it's just a headshot. Like for a
professional.
long time, it was my wedding headshot. And then I changed it I've been updating it every year or two to like our most recent family picture.
Yeah,
So.
the picture that I don't recommend is the one where you have blurry eyes and you can tell that your best friend was cut out.
Yeah, no, definitely not that. Like if it's just you, make sure it's a professional headshot or like we get, professional photos taken every year of our family. And we actually have like in our great room, we have like these big, used to be able to get them at Costco, but the big metal like printouts, right? That we kind of hang them, and then we have like one lower, and then we have these other ones high, and we're slowly accumulating one every year, which is kind of cool to watch our kids, and it's kind of a conversation starter for people. So,
Awesome.
yeah.
Awesome. So that's it. LinkedIn's the best way. Are you
LinkedIn's
on there
the best
quite
way.
a bit?
Yeah, especially right now. I definitely check it at least once a week, right? I'll check any messages or things to reach out. And so especially if people reach out, I'm happy to connect. And at least I have an initial call. I have kind of a philosophy. I generally will say yes to anything once, which is why I said yes to this podcast, even though I'd never done one before. I feel like there's a lot of value in experiencing new things. You never know what will happen if you say yes. But you do know what happens if you say no, which is nothing.
Absolutely. So I too can be reached on LinkedIn. I am on there daily. So I don't have the luxury of going on there once a week. It is, as a recruiter, you live on LinkedIn.
Yep.
So I'm on there constantly. And if you just Google me, it's Chad Dean, Integrated Management. I come up number 1 on there. Fortunately, I didn't pay for that, but it happens over time. And so that's it. I want to thank you for sharing everything that you did, and you're a very honest person, and the advice that you gave to people, just talking about your background, is going to be very valuable to people. And I know it's appreciated out there, and I appreciate you spending the time and getting over that barrier and doing something new and coming on the podcast.
And I appreciate you having me on. It's been a great experience. And for me, it's definitely been very reflective, right? To think about my life and, try to encapsulate it in an hour.
Cool. Well, maybe we can do a new one when you land your new gig, huh?
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Financial Footsteps, Candid Conversations with Financial Leaders. We encourage you to apply the knowledge and wisdom shared in these conversations to your own career. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to our podcast and leave a review. Your feedback is important to us as we continue to bring you more candid conversations and thought-provoking insights from successful financial leaders.